My name is Amber Paris. I'm the Climate Change Advisor for the California Department of Fish and Game, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our February lecture of the Climate College. I am especially happy to welcome my good friend and colleague, Doug Parsons, to give our lecture today. I know some of you have heard me mention Doug in the past, but really Doug was the whole mastermind behind the Climate College lecture and did this when he was with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and was very helpful and open and honest about what worked well in his college so that we could design something here in California. So it's really a testament not only to Doug's commitment to helping the Climate College here in California be successful, but also the Park Service, who allowed him to fly from DC to participate in this lecture with us. So thank you, Doug, for being here with us today. Kevin's going to do the formal introduction, but I had just a couple things to share with you guys as we get started. The normal housekeeping, please mute your cell phones. And for all of you who joined us today in person, as I promised last month, I do have cookies. Thanks to Erin Aquino Carhart for bringing those cookies for us. So, and for all of you on the WebEx, thank you for being with us today. And you are in listen-only mode, but please type in your questions, and we'll make sure that we get those questions to our speaker. One just quick reminder, we do have the projects coming up. We have asked you guys just to send an email to us indicating that you are interested in doing a project and either some kind of a title or idea. We have gotten a phenomenal response of some really cool ideas that people are going to be working on. Some things they're working and collaborating with other people in their team. Some folks are writing papers, but some folks are going out to local universities and working with undergraduate students and giving lectures in the college. Others are going to their children's high school AP class and giving a lecture about climate change. So there's all these really interesting ideas that are popping up. We're really excited that the Fish and Game family and some of our partners have come forward with some really exciting projects. So please get us your ideas soon so that we can tally you on the list. We are beginning planning our June awards ceremony to celebrate all the projects and everyone who's completed the course, and our director will be there. So we want to get started on that planning and have a good idea of the number of projects we want to showcase. So please get your ideas into us as soon as you can, and Whitney and I will follow up with an email. I recognize that I've been talking about this course, but this is really the first time the department has done this. And this is definitely a learning process, and we're seeking your input on how to make future colleges, climate colleges, really tailored to what you need. And I realize that in doing this, I have failed to give you guys an update on what we are doing within the department on a lot of these different activities. So we had this great lecture about what other states are doing, other federal partners, and I thought, I probably should have shared a little bit more about what Fish and Game is doing. So this particular lecture gives me an opportunity to share with you some of the things we have done as a department around education and outreach around climate change. So I wanted to give you just a quick snapshot of some things. There's a lot of things that I think we can really be proud of that we've worked on as a department, that we've worked on with our partners, and just wanted to make sure you guys all knew about some of these activities. So I think many of you are familiar with the Climate Magazine we worked on with partners, and that through the generosity of the Nature Conservancy was printed. But the idea was we wanted a magazine to really tell the story and reach out to policymakers and the public about the department as an important piece of the climate solution. And I think this was one first step at doing that. It also received a Gold Award for Excellence for Government Communication in 2010. Another thing that we've just recently completed is a new website that's focused on climate change curriculum that's specific to wildlife and habitats. And so this was really part of the development of our statewide climate adaptation strategy, that we wanted to also provide resources to reach out to the next generation, to reach out to provide resources for teachers who are thinking about this, and hopefully in the future to partner with them. But this is kind of the first step in creating a website with these curriculum materials. And this just went out live this week, I believe, thanks to Whitney. Another thing that we had talked about was this really fun collaborative project called the Climate Menu. We've been working with the Department of Public Health, the Department of Water Resources, and a couple of folks over at UC Davis to think about how we can reach out to kind of a different contingent of partners or the public that we don't normally reach out to. And we thought a good way to do this was through food. So we came up with the Climate Menu, and then talked about how those different pieces, not that those different resources will not be available, or they might not be gone, but they might not be locally harvested or available in California. And so I'm happy to say that after a year of planning, we have a mock-up poster, and the menu is, today's menu is a walnut-encrusted trout served over Sacramento-grown rice with a mixed leaf salad and broccoli florets, served with a delicious California wine. And the idea is all of these things are potentially impacted by climate change, and that state agencies are working collaboratively to safeguard the food on your plate. So we see this as one of maybe a series of posters and menus, this whole idea of doing this outreach around climate change. So we'll hope to have those posters out soon. We're working through the process of finalizing it, and we're really excited to start to develop these ideas. We also have a recipe for action, which is a fun way to sort of share the things that the people who are reading the poster can do to be a part of that. A big part of our outreach has really been internal. It's been focused on building a community within Fish and Game. We've talked before about these spotlights on climate change, to talk about what your colleagues and friends in the department think about climate change, what they're working on. Another thing that we've done around our sustainability initiative is what we call our sustainability superstars. And we have Crilly Butler, who is one of our sustainability superstars here in the room. But again, is the idea of sort of building a community around these issues and being able to hear what your colleagues and friends are thinking about these issues. And that's our website for the Sustainability Superstars. And then last but not least is really our whole climate college is about building our community and reaching out internally. So I thought that was a nice segue. I wanted to share a little bit more, and I'll try to have more of these vignettes of what we're doing internally. But with that, it is a great honor to have Doug with us, and a great pleasure to have Kevin Hunting, our Chief Deputy, here to introduce Doug. And we always appreciate Kevin's support of our climate college as well as our executive leadership.
So thanks, Amber. I enjoy doing these introductions during the climate courses. It's such a great program, and we've got some really just top-notch people that have been willing to participate from throughout the U.S. and in California, and it turned out to be just a great experience for me and something I'm proud that our department offers. So I'm going to read a little bit about Doug. I've got a little bit of bio background, but I also wanted to just relate how I know him and what I think he can bring to this presentation. So, Doug's the climate change response, is the license, the climate change response program for the National Park Service in D.C. Works on a variety of issues within the climate change program with an emphasis on climate change education and communication. And prior to that, and this is, I think I first met you, Doug, when you were with Florida, was a climate change coordinator since 2007 there, and helped develop the climate change initiative in Florida. Florida is one of the leading states for climate change adaptation work, I think, especially, kind of along the lines of the same programs we have. So it's great to have Doug out here. I met Doug through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, through the Climate Change Committee, both at the national level in AFWA and then the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Climate Change Committee, and he was always an active member in that committee. Several, you can always tell the states that are really involved in climate change adaptation and mitigation are the ones that come to the table with the good ideas and and the real participation in those committee settings. And so I appreciate Doug's input. And for today, one of the things we've talked about at the committee level over the last year is how do we communicate climate change adaptation concepts, principles, things we're doing at the department to our employees and to the public. And on the surface it sounds easy, but it's really not easy to do that, especially for people who are not used to, kind of talking in the currency of climate change and a warming climate and adaptation for wildlife and natural resources. So I was really intrigued to, start learning a little bit more about communicating climate change, and quickly came to the conclusion that Doug's kind of a leader in that field, so we're lucky to have him here. Doug.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that. It's a real honor. I've been communicating with Amber about this for a while now, and it's great to be here in person. We did something similar in Florida, and it was always nice to kind of sneak into the background. I didn't actually have to present, so now she recruited me, so here I am now. So, it's been fantastic to see the evolution of this. We completed ours about a year and a half ago, and just seeing what you guys are doing here in California, it's just, you guys tend to do things better than the rest of the country, and so it's like, what's California going to do? So what I wanted to do here is, I've got my presentation in two parts, and so I wanted to talk about my experiences in Florida, because I thought that'd be relevant to what you're doing here in California at a state wildlife level, and then I'm just going to shift abruptly to my role at the National Park Service. I've been working there for about 13 months, and just give you a sense of what the climate program's like, and then get into a bit more detail on how we do communication, education, climate literacy, doing some really interesting things at the Park Service. But I thought I'd start off with my background in Florida, just because there's some lessons to be learned there, and I think, you know, you guys are going to be wrapping up in the next few months, and so don't repeat the mistakes we made, those kind of things. And so, again, thanks, Amber, and thanks to everyone for having me here. And first time in Sacramento, you know, I don't get out west much, at least this far west, and so here I am, California. And this shot, I don't know why I sent this shot. I work in D.C., and that's at Rocky Mountain National Park, which was one of those nice days, like, oh, I'm working for the Park Service. Typically, I'm in a tie, suit, you know, it's no more casual state wildlife, you know, clothes. You know, you go to a association meeting and everyone's in jeans and a button-down shirt, so I have to wear a tie now. So, okay, just introduction here. Just I'm going to start off with the Florida work, but I am with the National Park Service in case you get a little bit confused with that. So I'm just going to, and I think we've got plenty of time here, but I'll try to keep track of how much I'm going on. I want to have time for questions and such. And so Paradise and Peril, this is our background, and this is I'm using the logo here from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I like to use this slide. This is a burrowing owl in Florida. It was always, I thought, a good symbol of our approach to climate change. You know, we're kind of coming out of our hole, and, you know, we have to come out, but we're slowly but surely doing it. So that was very symbolic for climate change planning in the state wildlife agencies. Just a little bit background with the commission. I think it's very similar to California. I think Florida and California both have very large wildlife agencies. Some of them are quite small. A lot of, I mean, Kevin mentioned that we hook up a lot at the Association for Fish and Wildlife Agency meetings, and there's a lot of hook and bullet agencies there, hunting, fishing, and then maybe one person working on non-game, whereas I think California and Florida really have robust non-game programs. And so we were very fortunate in Florida. The non-game program was quite large, and so just kind of give you a sense about it. These numbers change, but it's 2,000 employees, quite large. A little bit more background about the landscape that, you know, we were working in. A lot of, I was trying to find some numbers here in California, but, you know, we do have a lot of species. And what's the total number of species in California? I mean, did anybody know that number? I mean, just, yeah, everything. I think we had 15,000 in Florida. Whew, beat California something else. No, so but both states dealing with a lot of biodiversity. You go up a little bit farther north, and like in Maryland and stuff. Oh well, we've got raccoons, and you know, it's I live in Maryland, so they wouldn't be happy with that. But it's much different. So a little bit background too. When the state, Charlie Crist was governor at the time, and he was inspired by your governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, on climate change. And I don't know what Schwarzenegger's reputation is now, but at the time he was a leader on climate change, and he inspired our governor to take action. And so our commission, the agency is run by a commission, passed this resolution, and even though it's just this little thing on paper, it's actually quite important. It talked about the key things: climate change is happening, humans are responsible. I mean, really the key language that we were able to come back to this resolution later when things sort of got kind of like, you know, there was pressure maybe not to do these sort of things. Right? They signed it, those commissioners signed it and said you can work on these things, and we want our staff to work on these things. One of the things we did first was we had a huge climate summit, and we had all sorts of folks involved with this. It actually got some national attention. We were surprised. This was in Orlando, Florida, and this was our sort of like, you know, coming out on climate change was this climate summit, and we invited a lot of, you know, different speakers. We had some IPCC speakers come to this event, and we really had the support of the state, and I bring that up again because things change politically, and so we didn't have so much support a bit later on, but this was really how we focused in the summit. Just a little bit of background, as you guys know how you are structured, how you address wildlife in the state. This is how we kind of broke down the climate summit on areas that we were going to focus on. And, you know, invasive species, a huge deal in Florida. But this is sort of set up in a lot of ways of how our divisions are set up. And I keep saying I can't let that go. I've been with the feds for 13 months now, and I still feel like, I don't still feel like a federal employee yet. You know, it's like people call you a sellout or something. They don't talk to me when I go to the AFL meeting. So you're fed. Still feel like a state person. And so I just want to make a point is that they recruited all the division directors to come actually lead these sessions, and that was a big deal. They had to come, and then like a room full of 30, 40 people each of these sessions, they led it, and they had this conversation. So it wasn't one of those, oh, let's give it to the climate person or whatever. It's like they had highest levels involved with this planning. And just some of the things that came out of it. This document here is actually online if you're interested. This is the summit report that came out of it, and you probably recognize a lot of these things, reports that you've done, downscaling information, getting partnerships involved, and so nothing too profound, but it was good to get it all on one sort of document and letting us kind of focus on the issue of climate change. And soon after that, our director said, okay, what are we going to do now? And so we decided we're going to do an internal survey. I'm not sure how your agency works, but wildlife agencies, even in Florida, are still quite conservative in how people approach issues. And so we thought, where are people at on climate change? Even though our leadership was behind it, the governor was behind it, what was the rank and file? What did they think? And so we sent out this survey. And we had 350 respondents, which this isn't scientific, but it still gives you a sense of what do people think about this issue? And so it was good. I have underlined here 2 key questions on climate change. Do you think climate change is happening? We wanted to get these out there, even though it's not wildlife related. And do you think humans are responsible? Because we thought that was going to be very, insightful on where are people at. People, oh, the climate is always changing, but it's like, no, our humans, and we just wanted to get a sense of where folks were at on that. And partly what we're trying to do here is create sort of a branding of climate change, getting people comfortable with the thought. And I want to share some of the quotes from the survey. These were all the skeptic responses. The vast majority were like, we think climate change is happening, humans are responsible. So that was encouraging. I think the numbers were like 80, 85. It's like, we're a science agency. But this top one, as a science-based management agency, employees should be encouraged to review the best scientific information available before drawing conclusions. And this was coming from a skeptic. The irony there is like, well, that's exactly what we did. And, and that's what the climate scientists are telling us. And so here's someone who, we're a science-based agency, and he has a different conclusion. A couple others here, not very happy with that we're focusing our attention on this. And then we can't change the weather. Obviously, not even a basic understanding of what, the whole issue of climate change is about. And so that was very revealing. That's how we wanted to kind of, what are we going to do next? And I love this last one. FWC does very little to contribute, meaning carbon emissions, especially given we can't travel anywhere. Someone who just shows their bitterness about lack of travel, and they don't want us to work on climate change. I really enjoyed that one. That said it all. So just kind of, this was more of the skeptic side, but it still represented a lot of folks. One of the things that we quickly did was we created an internal climate blog. I was responsible for this, and we called it Climate Niche, a clever play on wildlife niche. And I love this blog, and I did 99% of the posting, even though it was open to anyone. And I just constantly, all right, guys, go post. Amber, I'm sure you probably have these same issues, but you look at all these ones on the left, 99% of those were mine. It's like, everyone, it's your blog, go blog. But, all right, I can say whatever I want on it. But you still had to, this is the public record, so I had to be sensitive to that. So what also quickly came out of the summit was that, okay, how are we going to plan for climate change? And so within the agency, what sort of infrastructure did we want to develop? There was no line item of, okay, here's $1 million for the climate change program. I mean, that wasn't happening. But other folks who are more enthusiastic about this can potentially work on this. And so what was good, I actually was hired not to work on climate change, but they let my position evolve, and I basically became the agency's climate change coordinator, which I don't know if it reflects well on what they thought my original position was, but they saw a tremendous amount of value in, let's work on climate change now, Doug, you're the climate change coordinator. And from there, so we had a climate change steering committee made up of 5 division directors, which was nice, very high-level folks. And then what we did is we broke it up, and I was looking at your website, and I think you have some similarities, but we had these different work groups. And so we had research and monitoring, adaptation, and then we had these other 3, policy, communication, and operations. And operations was more about carbon mitigation, so that one kind of really dropped off quickly just because it was more of like, energy efficiency, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so the whole point of these groups was like, how can we start integrating climate change into these areas within all the different divisions? And this was the structure. We don't know if that was, is this the best way to do it? We don't know. I'm trying to think at the time, we kind of probably copied from various entities on the right way to do it. But the research and monitoring, the adaptation work groups were the ones that attracted the most folks. We had a lot of scientists in the agency, and that's the ones that they gravitated toward. And so those actually broke ground into these subgroups, terrestrial, marine, freshwater. And so these people would go off and work in their own groups, coming up with ways of like, how are we going to integrate climate change planning into our freshwater work? So a lot of moving parts involved with this, and you know, it was good that the division directors gave their staff permission to work on these things. All right, you can 25% of your time, 10% of your time, and so these teams were kind of chugging away, focusing on these issues. And so this, Amber had mentioned that we'd done something similar in Florida with the climate change course, and so as all these things were happening, I kind of, as the climate change coordinator, I was a bit frustrated that I felt like, you know, folks weren't necessarily getting the issue of climate change. Think about it, even 3-4 years ago, things have changed radically, even in that time frame. When it comes to climate change, 6 months can be a huge difference. And so I want, from what I was seeing, even with the scientists, it's like there's just that, I think people weren't connecting the dots of what they were doing and kind of getting what adaptation was. And so just after some conversation with folks, we thought, why don't we do a climate course? And so this is, I mentioned branding. Our branding was FWC Adapts, you know, trying to play on adaptation, and this was the whole initiative within the agency. And I had a couple slides, and I took these out, and I don't want to focus too much on them, but what happened here, we had a new election for governor, and I don't know if you follow Florida politics much, but Rick Scott, I'm being nonpartisan here because I'm a federal employee, was not keen on climate change. And so we pretty much had to go stealth. We just went underground. We had a pretty robust communication, meaning like dealing with the press, putting things out there, and we stopped that completely. And we're like, we're going to just do internally focused for the short term. There's still a lot we can do, and this climate course was a perfect example. This was, you guys, this is open for everyone, I think, right? You have NGOs who are on the computer or might be here. This was just for FWC employees, and so a lot of that was in response to the political environment just got toxic. Our director, Nick Wiley, he's just like, Doug, you can still do climate change, but no one can hear about it. And so it's like, all right, well, let's focus on some things that we can do internally. And yeah, that's, you know, as you guys know, we're government employees, that's pretty demoralizing just when, you know, you're the governor, not even sure climate change is happening. And in Florida, we're not like some of the other southern states, and so it was, that too was, what do I mean by that? I always was proud when I saw Kevin at the Apple meeting, Florida, we're doing climate change, and then it's just like, oh man, it's just like Mississippi. So we went underground, and the climate course was the main product of that. And so I think you've probably seen something like this. This is the structure that we did too. We had monthly speakers, readings, and we put a lot of thought at the beginning about what we want to accomplish. And, you know, I don't have formal training in, you know, educational theory. I mean, there are people like that, but it's just like, what do I want in a course? And my bosses weren't suggesting anything, and so it's like, this is what I want. And so we kind of laid it out in a certain way, and I had support staff like you do here that were on board with this. And so we're just kind of playing it by ear on what we were doing. So this is kind of the structure that we set up. And forum participation, I'll kind of explain that a little bit. I'm doing all right. Quickly, you had your monthly speakers. These were all the speakers that we identified, and you know, this was me emailing, getting on the phone, recruiting folks. I'd like to just point out a couple people here. Eric Barron is the president of FSU. He's actually a climatologist. He used to work in Boulder at the National Atmospheric Lab there. Amazing speaker. I mean, he's a guy who should probably be briefing, you know, the president. I mean, he was president of FSU, and we were able to recruit him to come just there in Tallahassee. Pretty amazing presentation, kind of looking at society-wide how we're going to look at adaptation. We barely got him. A hurricane got in the way the first time, but we got Dan Ash, the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, to come to Florida to speak to our group. And so we really had a nice mix of folks, but we had 2 or 3 folks that represented Florida interests, and I think that's what you're doing here in California too. And yeah, those were our list of speakers. And then I think you guys are doing a variation on this. I think I like what you guys are doing. You're doing awards and all that, but we had a final project, and you know, for those who stick it out, you can do a PowerPoint or you could do a paper on integrating climate change into your day job. And so I was concerned that people wouldn't stick it out for the 10 months of the course. I'm like, how do I maintain their interest? And so I was able to find some funding, because we were not going to pay for this, that if you stuck it out and we were going to have a competition for best, you know, paper or presentation, and I think we ultimately said if you wanted to be eligible for the award, you had to do a presentation. They got to go to the Wildlife Society meeting, which happened to be in Hawaii that year, and so it was all expenses paid trip to that conference. And so I tell you what, you know, that the numbers stayed up for those 10 months. People wanted to kind of, and darn it, I wanted to go, but I didn't get to go. So that was nice to have that. I mention that every month, like when Amber was, I'm like, stick in, you know, you can go to Hawaii. And so we had one, Beth Dice won, and she went to Hawaii, and she brought me back some like macadamia nuts or something. I want to go quickly through this. Part of it, we have a discussion board. These are topics each month they would talk about. We had to be careful, though, because you look in the middle there, Fox News admits, we wanted to be robust conversations, open, but, you know, we're government employees. You can't go there and bashing people because, you know, we could get in trouble for that. And I had to moderate that. And sometimes it got borderline close to where I'm like, guys, no, you can't say that. But most of the time, people were very respectful, and it was a very interesting conversation. Here's just quickly some of the topics. I think you guys are starting to probably think about the topics that you're going to do, and I was just so impressed. This is some killer material. A lot of this is just kind of like literature review, but look at the topics that they were doing, you know, impacts of climate change on the American alligator and wading birds in North America. So these papers were written, and they're part of the record there in Florida. And this is when, if you completed it, you got a certificate of completion, and there was a ceremony for folks with the director signing it at the commission meeting. And just a summary, we had a planning team. We had about 100 employees enrolled. You guys, it sounds like, surpassed that big time. All the divisions were represented. And what I was most proud of, total cost was nothing. All the speakers that came in, I think 80% were out of state. They did it on their own dime. You know, it was just like, here's a captive audience. It wasn't that hard to sell to get them to come down. It's like, you can come and talk about what you do to all these, you know, practitioners on wildlife, and it wasn't a hard sell to kind of get them to pay their own way. And so I paid my way here. Good work, Amber. Lessons learned. This is, I think, relevant for you guys. It's just that all staff were involved. We had law enforcement people there. Surprisingly, we had training opportunities within the agency, but a lot of it was like leadership training or like things that just, you know, are important, but we actually didn't have a lot of science training. This was one of the first courses that actually was science training, and so there was a real demand for that. Promoting networking, so I think there's all sorts of people from the state listening in right now, and so that was the same thing. It was getting people together, and they'd have their side conversations, and then at the bottom, I just want to point out, you know, rare opportunity for institutional change. Climate change is a very big deal, and this, I think, is going to drive a lot of that. We're going to see a lot of things happen in the next 5-10 years. I don't want to spend much time on this, but Dan Ash was there, so all the leadership showed up, of course, the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and so we had a captive audience, and it's like, okay, what would you want to tell, you know, your leadership about climate change? And this is a couple of years after the summit, so we just were able to just say whatever we wanted. It was quite nice. And even Nick Wiley, you know, he's the director and he supported what we did, but he didn't know half the stuff we were up to. And so it was like, okay, here's my chance to brief you on what we're doing. And finally, why climate course? I'm stealing this idea from Mike Harris from Georgia. He uses this, don't jump the shark. And as you guys well know, is with climate change, a lot of people saying, oh, it's just doing the same thing that we've always done, but, you know, we're just maybe applying it to climate change. That's not really the case. There are completely new things here. You know, you're doing scenario planning. You're bringing future models into what you're doing. That's not status quo. And so what I worried about is that, you know, especially the need for the course, is that if people are not comfortable with this, you know, the whole point of don't jump the shark, most people don't know what this is. I'll quickly say, like, if you guys watch Happy Days, there was an episode where Fonzie got on the skis and he jumped the shark-like thing, and people were just like, why is Fonzie jumping sharks now? It's just, you know, and so the whole expression came out of that episode. They took Happy Days where it shouldn't have gone, and so the whole point of it relating that to adaptation is like, if we're not careful, we're going to take wildlife management where people are not comfortable going yet. And so the point of the course was to get everyone exposed to the terms and the new reality of dealing with climate change, so we're not kind of like lapping people. Because if you don't bring everyone along, you're just not going to be very productive. And so that was sort of the whole point of the course. And that's don't dump the shark. And there's a new expression, it's like don't nuke the fridge. The latest Indiana Jones had a scene where Indiana Jones gets in the fridge and it's nuked, and that was awful. They shouldn't have done that with Indiana Jones. And so that's replaced don't jump the shark. Now I want to transition into the National Park Service. That's what I'm doing today, in case you're wondering why is he talking about Florida too much. I'm Climate Change Liaison based in D.C. It's a classic D.C. name, Liaison, you know. I'm a liaison. I have to roll my eyes every time I say that at a meeting, and people just kind of poo-poo it, but that's what they call me. But that's what I do, actually, too. I liaise in D.C. It's one of the things you have to do. A little bit of background on our program. This is the difference between Florida and the Park Service. You know, I said I've been here about 13 months. The program's actually relatively new, about 3 years old. It has a line item. There's actual money for it, Amber. We've talked about this. There's real money. And so that's nice. I joined a program. This is the core team. Lee Welling is the chief. She's based in Fort Collins. There's a few of us in D.C., but most of them are out in Colorado. We've kind of broken it up into adaptation, science, and communication. I kind of go all over, but my role, a lot of my role is to attend meetings. I'm a professional meeting goer. My bosses will be like, okay, you need to go to this meeting. BLM's holding this meeting. You go, Doug. It's climate related. So partly that's the role of the liaison, but I do a lot of communication too. And Patrick Gonzalez, I just want to point him out. He's a climate change scientist. That's really nice. That's a big difference than what I was used to in Florida. He's a lead author for the IPCC. I mean, if I have a climate change question like, you know, obscure modeling, I'll just be like, Patrick, what about this? And he keeps up with all the literature. And I didn't have that in Florida. I mean, I was definitely just a generalist in Florida. And it's nice to have that sort of expertise and have access. I mean, he's 30 feet away, and I'll go, Patrick, I heard about this new supercomputer, and then he'll just pat me on the head. Oh, that's not what it means at all, Doug. And so the good team and the expertise, it's just like what I was doing on steroids. And that's just communication, as you can see, is a big part. And I'm not showing their photos, but there's actually even probably another 15, 20 people who work really hard on climate change, but they're embedded in different divisions, the planning division, the water division. The whole point was to kind of spread the wealth, the money that we got, we helped fund their positions. These are all people that just report directly to Lee Welling, though. And just I want to point out, too, is that 2 weeks after I started, I don't know if you guys remember the whole continuing resolution battle from 13 months ago, but that's when they passed that continuing resolution, and there was a big witch hunt on climate change, and that our program had a 70% cut. And so that I joked with my boss, I'm like, is this normal? You know, just 2 weeks after I start, and like, Doug, if this would happen a month ago, you wouldn't be with us right now. So with the whole changeover in the 2010 election, obviously our program was singled out. You have climate change in your title, and people aren't happy about it. I think there's a bit of a thaw now, but that was a really nasty time. Like, my boss, I'm starting in 2 weeks later, she's got other things on her mind and helping train the new guy, so. Now I just want to talk a bit about the program and then get into some of the education that we're involved in. Here's our strategy. I'm going to walk away, but I've got some right there if you're interested. I've got some hard copies. Please come up and take them. 4 key elements: science, adaptation, mitigation, and communication. I joke with my boss, if you kind of play with the first letters and create an acronym for that, it's SCAM. So don't highlight that because we could get in trouble. And then the action plan. So you have a strategy. Most folks really don't know what to do with the strategy, but it's important that you have one. So the next level is kind of creating an operational plan, and that's what we did, create an action plan, and that just came out in December. That, too, is available on our website, and that really gets into this person's going to be doing this. And that's going to be our focus for the next 18 months, is that our action plan is going to really drive the specific items that we do, how we direct our money, and so it was a big step, and we have the blessing from senior leadership on that. So I want to quickly go over, we have 8 sort of focus areas. These are going to be our priority actions for the next couple of years. You know, literacy, sort of what I'm doing right now. Planning is a big thing, and I'm sure it's a big thing for you guys, but for all the national parks out there, we have general management plans. So Yosemite has a general management plan. The goal is to get climate change integrated into that. And I should have mentioned, I work with Lee Welling, and the way the National Park Service is structured, and this was new to me too, because is that I'm based in D.C., but I'm part of WASO, and we're just a support to the parks. And so when you think of national parks, you think of Grand Canyon, you think of the park rangers. There are the parks and the park superintendents, but then there's support staff. And so I'm part of that support staff, and I'm not associated with any individual park. There is quite a bit of difference. There's quite a bit of autonomy within those individual parks. And so they need help with climate change planning. We're there to help them. But it's like I don't have any direct link with some of those cool parks. So support basic climate. I mentioned Patrick Gonzalez. He's helping with that. I want to point out, implement Green Parks Plan. And this is what happened in Florida too, is that, you know, we're being required, there's presidential orders, executive orders on reducing your carbon footprint. But for Lee Welling in our program, carbon mitigation is just not a big focus. And I don't know, I think there's probably a separation with you guys too, even though it's a big focus. Or are you in charge of mitigating carbon? Okay. Okay. Well, it's all connected, but in reality, we don't spend really any time with that. The operations people deal with it. I don't talk about mitigation much at all. I mean, it's important, but we've really separated adaptation away from mitigation, and that naturally happened in Florida too. So they're not an easy fit. Partnerships and collaboration. We, at the National Park Service, a lot of people like to work with us. We were joking we're the charismatic megafauna of federal agencies. You know, it's kind of nice being that way. I'm going to mention some of these tools a little bit later, but that's part of what the program does. Communication is a huge part of our focus. And then with the national parks, we have a huge volunteer network, and working with young people is just a major focus of what we do. And now getting to climate training, just so you can quickly look over that, I don't want to read these, but this is kind of the baseline messages that we sort of set for ourselves. And climate change is happening is probably the most important one. You know, the idea of well, we should be doing this anyway, I think sends mixed messages to people. It's like you have to reinforce that, yes, it's happening for a reason, and now we're going to have to do something. Because if you just say, well, we should do it anyway, you kind of undercut the goal. So some of the products that we work on, I'd mentioned on that one slide when I showed the communication team. We do monthly webinar where we're able to get people like this speaking, and just, you know, some top-notch speakers, folks from universities, other agencies, and we have a library now of probably 60 or 70 speakers that are available. So that's just a tremendous resource, excuse me. And just these are some of the other points that we have. We have climate change briefs. A lot of this information is on our website. So, you know, you look at our science program or just our strategy. Those are all one-page briefs if you're interested in looking at those. Individual parks come up with their own videos kind of highlighting specific issues, and then the sustainability. We don't necessarily work on that, but I've included because it is part of that broader climate change picture. And I've got the website here. We just have a ton of material there. Highly recommend. The action plan is there, and the strategy is there as a PDF file if you're interested in taking a look. And a little bit deeper on our education. And so this is new, and this is very exciting. It's like a lot of folks, you know, down in you know, staff level of the agencies work on these things, but does leadership get involved? And we actually created a training for park superintendents. And so how we work the Park Service, if you're not familiar, superintendents run the parks. They are the boss. And so we created a climate change training course for them. And so we recruited a few superintendents to actually help lead this, like Dan Kimball, who is the superintendent at Everglades, which is one of the big parks, helped with that. And so it was kind of, you know, it was an online webinar that got leadership involved with focusing on climate change. And this next one, and I want to highlight, is that we're working with Harpers Ferry, which is our equivalent of NCTC, if you're familiar with the Fish and Wildlife Service Educational Center. Harpers Ferry is our sort of educational, and I was part of this project, and the goal was bringing climate change and developing resources for parks, and you guys probably developed these too, but our waysides are those signs that you see at the parks when you go up and you're looking at the Grand Canyon, and there's that sign that'll explain maybe the geology. That's our bread and butter, these waysides. And so this project was looking at coming up with some climate change waysides for just 3 or 4 parks, mainland coastal parks. But it was a fascinating process for me, is that you're trying to distill all this information down into a wayside that might be there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. How are you going to distill these complex, climate change issues specific for this park and in such a way that it's going to stand the test of time? And so we had just these people just going back and forth, what kind of information do we want? And one of the things that we really kind of butted heads on is like the Park Service, where, we like to have happy messages, and, you say all these dramatic things are going to happen to this landscape, but you want to end it on a positive note. So it's just like, well, what can you do? Well, you can change your light bulb and have energy-efficient light bulbs and drive a Prius. And I argued from the position, I thought that was trite. I thought it's just like, just lay out the adaptation information, deal with it. Because you need to tell people that they need to drive more fuel-efficient cars, but like you were trying to cram these 2 very different messages onto this wayside, and I think it was kind of maybe giving people a false sense of like what's happening there. Of like, oh, well, all these bad things are going to happen, but if I change my light bulb, I can be part of the solution. And that's not necessarily true, but we had to try to do that. And so there was a big debate on interpretation. Interpretation is just bread and butter for the Park Service. And the last one there is frontline interpreters. Those are the guys you see when you go to these parks. Our interpreters are our interface with the public. I don't deal with the public. It's like, keep Doug away from the public. But our interpreters are the ones out there dealing with all sorts of questions, and so there was a training for them to get more comfortable talking about climate change. And they get some hostile questions. They're in some remote areas, and this is just a bunch of baloney, and they have to handle that really diplomatically, and so that's part of the training there. Partnerships, again, another advantage of working for the Park Service. Work with the National Science Foundation, a lot of just really big kind of, partnerships that you're able to collaborate with foundations and such, and so we have a big one focusing on education right now. Tim Watkins is leading that. And wanted to point out, I mentioned that we're doing all these things as part of the Climate Change Response Program, but the parks are actually taking the initiative on their own too, hopefully working with us. But Everglades is doing a lot of interesting things on climate change, and this isn't necessarily, our fingerprints aren't on this, it's the individual parks that are doing these things. Yosemite, Great Smokies, these are like, it was fascinating for me. There's a whole tier system of parks. Everglades is like the big kid on the block, Yosemite too, and then like, oh, who are the smaller parks? It'd be like Bill Clinton's birthplace or something. That's a very small budgeted park, but I mean, we have 400 park units, and so there's a whole tier system. But they're all equally important. I've mentioned planning, that we have these things called foundation documents for each park. Our goal is by 2016 that every park will include climate change to some degree in their foundation documents on how they plan to manage that particular park. And so this is a major initiative by our program. And so, it's not sexy, but getting information within planning processes is just a key to actually anything happening, because we talk about climate change and this and that, but unless you know what actually happens, until you get into something that people are looking at and they actually respond to, a general management plan, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z now because it's in here, is really important. It can be dry, the policy formation, but it's just very important. You guys have probably seen this, but we were involved with this, along with the state, Scanning the Conservation Horizon. National Wildlife Federation was leading this. Were you part of this, Amber? Were you on the team that did this? Okay, it's a toolkit on how to do vulnerability assessments. And so vulnerability assessments are one of the key planning tools for the parks. You do a vulnerability assessment, and hopefully that'll lead to actual adaptation actions, because right now there's a disconnect. You hear, like, what adaptation is happening on the ground, and people don't even know how to define adaptation. There's a big debate on that. And so you have vulnerability assessments and you have adaptation actions. And in theory, your vulnerability assessment and whatever outcome comes out of that process should tell you what your adaptation action should be. Because unless you know what the vulnerabilities are and the sensitivities to that landscape, how do you know what you should do for adaptation? And right now, people are jumping right into adaptation actions. But that's all right, because we're early. but we're trying to create a, sort of a structure to make a bit more sense. And so some of the examples, slowly but surely, more of the parks are doing vulnerability assessments. And since I had mentioned, we have Everglades that, if you look at the sea level rise scenarios, it's likely gone. It's going to be a marine park by the end of the century. But then, like I said, Bill Clinton's birthplace, how do they integrate climate change? What is a vulnerability assessment? Two very different things for different parks. Wanted to mention, I mentioned the memo for Florida. This took a while, but these things, again, are important. This is signed by the director, John Jarvis. This is our management policy associated with climate change. This gives you some guidance on how you do this. Climate change, stars have really aligned in the Park Service on climate change. Our leadership, John Jarvis, is just gung-ho on this. He's been appointed the lead to the Sandy response. I don't know how much you guys really kind of followed Sandy, but Sandy was really just a game changer in the conversation about climate change, and several of our parks were really affected, but you could start talking about it again. I mean, something good coming out of something very bad, but our director put the point person in charge of DOI's response to that, and there's a lot of money. They just passed a $50 billion supplement to respond to that, and so we're hoping to get a lot of adaptation planning out of that. And so the President in his inaugural address mentioned climate change, and so it was probably mentioned the most. And it's very exciting for us that it became such a major focus for the Park Service. Even though we've always had support, it's now, the last 3 or 4 months with the action plan, it's been fantastic. And some tools, we're working with a professor out of Western Carolina University. These are specific things that we can come up and share with the parks. These will all be available to folks outside the Park Service once they're complete. And I want to mention cultural resources. This was new to me. I don't have background in cultural resources, but the Park Service, again, that's another big part. People think Yosemite, but again, we manage some incredible bandolier. Cultural resources are a huge part of what we do, and we actually hired a cultural resources adaptation coordinator, which I thought was just a fascinating hire. And it's trying to integrate cultural resources and natural resources into adaptation planning. And I think, being in the wildlife community, sometimes forget that, but as the built environment starts responding to climate change, it's good to have this background to be sensitive to both. And these are just some of the areas associated with cultural resources. And I'd mentioned scenario planning. This is an area that we're getting a lot of expertise in. We're working with individual parks. They do scenario plans. What will it look like here in 2075? And we don't say that this is going to happen, but you just present various scenarios on what might happen, and hopefully that will inform decision making. So the key thing is not to say that what we're just proposing here is going to what we think is going to happen. It might happen based on these plausible assumptions. And so we're getting a lot of expertise in this right now. My boss is just gung-ho about scenario planning. And finally, the Climate Youth Initiative. I'd mentioned working with a lot of younger folks. We fund the George Melendez Wright Climate Change Internship. And the parks propose projects, and we have this money, and so each year, I'm supposed to review these soon, specific parks will have specific ideas for a climate change project, and then they'll have an intern that'll come and actually implement it. And so it's a way of getting money out to the parks, and just a fascinating, diversity of park projects, doing basic research or various communication efforts, and then there's a fellowship one that's more at the graduate level. And so, $20,000, and we're just creating a library of interesting information through this. And so, I think I went through quickly at the very end there, but is National Park Service, and I think I was trying to emphasize a lot of our educational. There's a lot more that we do, and you can see on our website. And I know we're almost wrapping up here. I might have a little time for questions. That was 40 minutes, so. Well, and yeah, we certainly think about that. Probably not doing as good a job as we should, but we have these things called natural heritage areas, which aren't actually park units that we manage, but it's a designation for a landscape around important areas, and so it's a way of working with the private sector a bit more. And so that's a tool that we have to look at a broader landscape. But specifically, like, you know, your background in BLM, DOI just released its adaptation policy, and so that whole effort was to try to get the different bureaus in DOI to come up with their own adaptation plan, and DOI is going to kind of guide how everyone's going to work together. So if you look at the individual park units, some of them are surrounded by BLM land. BLM owns a lot more land than the Park Service, and the goal of that adaptation policy is to do exactly what you're talking about. It's not going to be easy. I go to a lot of really bad meetings where, you know, the different bureaus come together and talk about what they're doing. That's sort of like the happy face of, oh, this is what we're going to do, but in reality, it's much different. But there's measurable progress. We're headed in that direction. So in response, the DOI policy is an attempt to do what you ask. Sure, okay. Okay, the question is just, were there any sort of tangible results that came out of the work that we did in Florida? And that's why I left. I don't know, before we had to measure that. Well, I would say, you know, for the course, tangible results is something like 100-plus people got trained in the background in climate change, and so I consider that a very tangible result. The groups that I'd mentioned were all doing planning, and that was a very frustrating part for a lot of the scientists. It's just like you have to plan before you kind of do anything. And so to the point where are you doing a specific management action on the ground differently, they weren't quite there yet. I mean, we were able to get money. A lot of it was just sort of upfront planning. We got money to hire a sea level rise coordinator because a lot of things were happening within the universities and other agencies on sea level rise, and so we wanted to be at the middle of that. I'd consider that a specific outcome of that work. We never would have gotten that position hired, but I still think there's 3 to 5 years. There was money dedicated to integrating climate change in the State Wildlife Action Plan, which you guys are doing here too, but I would say the vast majority of it is planning. And, you know, bean counters would say that that's something tangible, but I think I know what you're talking about. That was, you know, was this landscape managed differently based on climate change integration? And there's just not a lot of that yet. I think it's going to take 5, 10 years before people really start working that out. But like investing in like Florida Forever, I think that's quickly happening. That was our land buying program there. They started thinking about climate change. Are we not going to buy a parcel of land because of sea level rise? That is a tangible outcome based, let's say, on some scenario planning that might have gone in, a model that says this is going to be underwater. Nature Conservancy was already making that decision in Florida. They pulled out of investing in land in the Florida Keys, which was a big deal. We weren't quite there yet, but they're prepping to get there. That'd be a sort of a tangible decision. The question is just how does the National Park Service integrate what maybe the state is doing? So we have our own plans at the park level, and then the state has their own plans, and how are we sort of aligning those two? Yeah, great question. I don't think the State Wildlife Action Plans have come up in any of our conversations at the park level. There really is a separation, and I think the Park Service has that reputation, you know, is like, oh, they like to do their own thing, and I think they're working on that. I mean, I'll go to some of these meetings, oh, we hate you Park Service people, you think you know it all. So, no, I think climate change planning is forcing us to do that a lot more, and so I guess to that question, I think we're going to get better at it, and I don't have the history with the Park Service. I'm sure some parks do a great job on outreach to their surrounding communities. Others are just like, we know everything and we're going to do it our way. And so hoping climate change forces a lot more collaborations than what we've had so far. But our program specifically, a lot of our stuff is once you become a Fed, you're just dealing with federal people, and there's interfaces with the state, but it's not as robust as it should be. I go to so many meetings where no one outside the federal system is even invited. Yeah, it's true. Gosh, DC thing.
Is this working? Oh. For one of the parks.
Okay, question is, can I give an adaptation strategy for one of the parks? And so what we consider an adaptation action right now, because we have to report these to the Department of Interior, is our scenario plan workshops. And so there's not really a lot of on-the-ground action. So like Badlands National Monument has done a scenario planning workshop, and so we would consider that an adaptation action. There are some things that, are a work in progress. So Everglades, after the hurricanes, I think it was back in 2005, really just demolished some of the visitor centers. Or Flamingo Point in the Everglades. They were going to rebuild this area at a cost of tens of millions of dollars, but then the director said, no, you're not going to do this, and they made a decision to go with modular construction. So these are things that you could move inland if you needed to. And so we use that a lot as an example of an adaptation action. That's something specific, but at the time it wasn't necessarily an outcome of specific climate change planning, but we're using that as a really good example now of like, okay, that really is an adaptation action. Sea level rise is going to happen. Now they're not going to spend nearly as much money rebuilding because we need to move that farther up. So that would be a specific example at the parks. But a lot of our work is scenario planning right now, just getting the parks more comfortable to make on-the-ground decisions later on. So, all right, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Thanks, Amber.
I just wanted to close up. Actually, I want to follow up on the question that you raised, Thomas. I think this is something interesting for us to be thinking about as a department when we talk about how you measure the success of, like, say, the climate science program or this kind of climate college. And because we're talking about, complete integration of climate change into everything we do. And that's really, when I talk about that, I'm always saying, it's not just about a new program, it's not just about new research, this is about changing the culture of our agency. And how do you measure that? How do you, figure out if you're being successful? Is it the number of management plans that we have climate change in? Is it the number of projects? But I also think that we need to think about how we define success, and maybe it's not something we're going to see for 5 or 10 years. But I think another key point that I would be interested in, maybe we can do this on the forum with people who are taking the course, but how do we communicate that kind of success with our partners that's not product-oriented? Because I think this whole thing that Doug has talked about today and that we've been trying to do through the Climate College, this is about sort of complete integration and mainstreaming climate adaptation into everything that we do. And how do you measure the success of that, and how do you communicate that kind of success to our partners in the public and policymakers? So that's something I've been thinking a lot about, so it's kind of nice you teed that up, and that was a great question, Tom. And I think that's something that we can kind of maybe be grappling about together as a department of how we communicate that. So thank you for a great lecture. It was great to have you here. A quick wrap-up, we're really excited for next month. We have Ashley Conrad-Seda joining us to give a lecture. She's from Cali, PA, so we're really excited to have her. And I believe that's it. And there are cookies, as I promised, so please come get your cookies. And thank you for coming and being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you.